listen to me talk about my work, my trajectory, the things that I do in my studio, and how all these little separate things sort of connect. So I'm going to show you a bunch of slides about different bodies of work. I also brought a few actual objects because my work is very object-oriented, so sometimes it's nice to be able to touch or to feel or to hold, and it translates a little differently than looking at the slides. So I do tend to bring a few of those. I don't have as much as I usually do because one of the bigger bodies of work that I have, we missed each other. But before I get started talking about my work, I thought I would talk a little bit about the overall kind of umbrella that I work under and how I came to get to the place that I'm at today. So my work is primarily grounded in contemplation of life in the 21st century. Process and materials are very important to my practice. I have a really kind of deep-seated desire to understand the history of the processes that I work with, and maybe not necessarily to a really deep level, but at least a basic understanding of the history. The longer I work on a process, the deeper I delve into that history. But I balance that with technical aspects. Technical proficiency and understanding is really important to me as well. And my work often references some of those historical aspects of what came before me working with those processes, as well as practitioners. But then I approach this with from a contemporary vantage point. So in the time that we have here today, you'll see that I explore current social concerns, and some work that deals with issues of the environment, issues that deal with money, exploring the role of the photograph in the book as object, and as a vessel for entertainment and information, and how that kind of balances or compares to today's technological laden society. You'll also see that I work on multiple projects at the same time, and part of that reason is because they're sustained, and I do work on them for a long period of time, sometimes years, as they kind of grow and develop further. So we'll go through this mostly chronologically. Span about the past 8 years, but I wanted to just kind of start with like my foundation. I attended graduate school at the Visual Studies Workshop in Rochester, New York for my master's in fine arts. I did do a master's of humanities previously at my undergraduate school. But I came to the Visual Studies Workshop in Rochester because of the size, the fact that it operated also as a nonprofit organization on its own, the history of photography that is just in the bones of Rochester, New York, and they also focus on, it's a kind of a three-pronged approach there: photography, book arts, and film. And I was interested in book arts as well. And I'll just quickly preface that I grew up doing ceramics and painting. I started undergrad school thinking I was going to be a ceramics major, and then kind of was lured away by the shiny and exciting metals and jewelry program. And I also took every printmaking class that I could while I was there, and was very disappointed to find out that I could not do a thesis in both. They were like, nope, pick one. And I was like, oh, okay. So I did. I've worked as a jeweler, I've worked as a screen printer, and I didn't actually even come to photography until my last semester of my senior year. So that continuation happened in that first master's program. So I eventually then found my way to Rochester for my MFA, and while I was there, I also worked at the Eastman House, which is now called the George Eastman Museum, and it's hard for me to kind of flip that switch to the new name. So there I was able to access this amazing rich history and breadth of photography, and not just in terms of images, but practitioners and processes and all the other kind of social aspects that were happening around it. If you don't know, the Eastman Museum has one of the most comprehensive collections of photography in the world. Not the biggest, just the most samplings from all of the different ways that photography's been used over the years. And while I was there, I met the process historian, Mark Osterman, who introduced me to his wife, France Scully Osterman, who, luckily for me, just happened to be looking for an assistant. So I ended up working for her for the duration of my MFA, and that gave me this unbelievable gift of time and access to knowledge about these processes that I was really interested in, from people who had been studying them for much longer than I have at this point. I mean, they had been studying them longer than I have up to this point now. So it was kind of a bittersweet moment when I was given a teaching position at Edinburgh University of Pennsylvania, just a few hours south on the western side of PA, which required me to move, obviously. And so I had to stop working for France too. But it was good. And then I was there for a couple of years, and then 2008 happened, and academia kind of had a little hiccup, and Edinburgh University was not immune. So following that financial crisis, I ended when my classes were cut. I took this opportunity to kind of make my way out to the University of Iowa, to the center of the book, where I was able to work with some other amazing people, among whom is Tim Barrett, who's a papermaker extraordinaire. He's really knowledgeable, an extremely generous teacher, and just an amazing person to work with. And so at the University of Iowa Center for the Book, or UICB, as I will probably refer to it for the rest of the talk, I continued my education in book arts and print and papermaking, and I earned a graduate certificate from there. Then, shortly after I finished up there, I was awarded the Post-MFA Fergus Family Fellowship in photography at the, don't forget to enunciate the Ohio State University. It's very important. So I moved from Iowa City to Columbus, Ohio, and I had another amazing gift of an entire year where I earned a paycheck to just make my work in the studio. I also could teach, which I did, and continued to teach there for the next 5 years. So I was there for a total of 6 years as a senior lecturer in the art department until I moved to Memphis, where I am currently the assistant professor of photography and area head for both the BFA and MFA photo programs, except the MFA photo program is now done. We graduated the last person and we're not taking it anymore. So, and if that doesn't make sense to you, it's because the school just announced it's closing like 3 months after I got there. So it's closing in May of 2020. But it's been wonderful being there, and it's been a really great opportunity, and really enjoyed it. But that's kind of been my trajectory in terms of education and background, and what has brought me here today. And so now I'll just talk about a few bodies of work. So first up is Insecurities and Exchange. And this body of work started while I was at UICB. And it investigates concerns that I have revolving around money and the anxiety that its absence or loss can generate or create or produce. And so what I did is I photographed these seemingly mundane tableaus, and I printed them using historic photo processes on handmade paper that had watermark text in it. So that this underlying kind of pervasive thought is only revealed when we change the way we view it, from reflected to transmitted light. And I mentioned that a lot of my work is kind of inspired by history. So back to when I was at the Eastman House, I had access to the technology and photographs collection. And the technology collection was by far my favorite. It's this ginormous vault of shelves from floor to ceiling of every kind of connection to the history of photography that was possible. Cameras, lights, posing stands, everything. And among those were the megalithoscope. I was particularly enamored with the megalithoscope. It was designed by Charles Ponty, and it was patented in 1861. and you take usually an albumin print. It's probably about this size, and then it's printed. It's adhered to a sort of slightly curved wooden frame, and then you insert it into the rear of the viewing device, which you can see there by the little lamp. So then you view that through the lens side, and this creates this really kind of wonderful optical illusion of depth and perspective, especially if you kind of turn your brain to 19th century experiences where, you know, it might seem a little dull now, but if you put yourself in the shoes of somebody living in the 19th century, this would be pretty amazing. So the prints are viewed by reflected light, transmitted light, or a combination of both. And this was, it was the whole package that excited me. The viewing device, the print itself, but also that interaction, that private interaction between the viewer and the objects. That itself, it wasn't like you could stand in a room with a large group of people and look at the same thing or kind of see it from afar. Like, you had to get up close, you had to interact it, you have to move something. So these are just a couple, just an example here. This is one of those megalithoscope slides from the collection. They're made somewhat translucent. They're colored from behind, and sometimes they're pierced in areas where there might be a light source. And so this image then changes from one thing to another. So this image here is with reflected light. This is the same scene that has reflected and transmitted light. And then the final scene with only transmitted light. So, you know, this was kind of high-end entertainment. Not everybody had access to this, of course, but it was pretty exciting, and you could collect these different slides from around the world. If you traveled, you might pick them up. If you didn't, then you could order them or buy them someplace else. But this was the inspiration for one component to this body of work, Insecurities in Exchange. So I built little houses. This is a view of one of the installations at the Perkins Gallery at the University of Rochester. So I built these little housing units to house the prints for Insecurities in Exchange. So this is the insecurity part. So as the observer, you are able to control the amount of light, whether you're looking at it as reflected light or transmitted light or kind of somewhere in between. So you get to walk up to these small little boxes on the wall and turn the little dimmer switch. And when you change the light source, the underlying pervasive worry about money is revealed. So this one is I am worried. And I had a series, there's a series of 8 of these. So, you know, again, not that money hadn't always been been a concern of mine after I entered into adulthood. But again, this kind of came as the result of that financial crisis in 2008. It wasn't just me. I was hearing stories on NPR all the time, people voicing their concerns about what's going to happen, what's my financial future going to be, am I going to have a job, how am I going to pay my bills, how am I going to make ends meet. And it was nice to know, I mean, nice is not the right word to say, but it was nice to know that I wasn't alone in that, so that, you know, it wasn't just a me-centered thing, but it was just me. Everybody else was feeling this too, so I thought that this was a good time to make this work. So the text that I chose to create in my paper was derived from a combination of the tapes that were continuously playing in my head, as well as those that I heard repeated so often in the news, that I would read, that I would hear on the radio. So it came up with 8 phrases that are a combination of these questions and some directives. Sometimes it's a directive. Some of which you've already seen, like I am worried, and the directive, stick to the budget. And the question is the worst yet to come. Will I get a job? Then there's another directive, cut back spending, just keep treading water. Things have to get better, and how am I going to pay my bills? I thought it would be interesting just to kind of show a little bit about how I made the paper. Again, because process is important to my work, and also the materials that I chose to use. The paper that I made is a combination of 25% linen and 75% cotton. I chose those specifically because those are the bulk of and close proportionate to the actual U.S. currency that we have. There's some secret ingredients thrown in there, so it's not so easy for counterfeiters to reproduce the paper that money is made on. And of course, the process is a little different, so the texture of my paper is not the same as a dollar bill, but it holds up pretty well. So this entire series, all 8 of those phrases, is pulled from one sheet of paper. So this is a screenshot of or a photograph of the mold and decal, and you can see the text is sewn onto the mold. So I soldered all of these tiny little letters together and painstakingly sewed them onto the screen with some fine copper wire. And I was so excited to get started making the paper that I sewed the text on right reading, which means that my paper is going to be wrong reading, so I had to take it off. But I caught myself with just the first phrase, so it wasn't the whole thing. So I slowed myself down and said, okay, pay attention. So it wasn't a huge loss of time. But the reason I was able to make all 8 of them at once is because I used these tear bars. So I also sewed these copper wires onto the mold so that the paper, when you pull the pulp out of the vat, it's thinner there, so it's really easy to tear apart after the sheet has been pressed and dried. The other component to insecurities in exchange is the exchange part, where you can exchange some of your government-issued bills for one of my slime bills. There's a full set of 20, so you could do just one. You could put a dollar bill into the box and take one of my slime bills, or you could get one of the full sets, which happens to have its own special wrapper. There's 20 different ones, using 20 different words for either a dollar bill specifically or just in general money, but not any other, it's not referring to a specific denomination, other than just the single. I signed my bills, because, you have to. And the set includes the slang words: buck, paper, moolah, lettuce, greenback, dough, bone, bako, bean, bacon, ace, clam, cheese, cabbage, red, script, smacker, single, simoleon, and then my personal favorite, I don't know why, I just like saying it, spondulic, which is a 19th century slang term for money or cash. And there's something about spondulic that I just really like. But the only ink that's on there is the ink from the pen when I sign my name. The rest of it is made entirely of paper and pigmented pulp. So this is really short fibers that have been pigmented. This is me testing to make sure that there's enough retention aid in there to keep the pigment adhered to the pulp fibers. And then it just simply gets put into a spray bottle, and then I spray it through an exposed silk screen over a freshly cooched sheet of paper, and then you end up with one full sheet of the entire set of slime bills. So then they get put into a restraint dryer and dried, and then after they're dried, then I can cut them into bill sizes and put them in their little wrappers. And then they're ready for exchange. So that was insecurities in exchange. The next big body of work that I started on was salvage. And this explores ideas of our disposable consumer mentality, sustainability, the plight of the planet. And I'm taking can lids and turning them into one-of-a-kind unique ferrotype. I guess you could call them drawings in a way, using plant material. I hesitate to call them photogenic drawings because there's an actual process that uses that term. And they're not that process, so I won't say that, but it's a nice word to use. But this body of work actually comes from these little cameraless botanical images that I started when I was at Edinburgh University of Pennsylvania. It started with just some dried herbs from my potted herb garden on my deck, but it expanded and grew once I started working for one of the retired ceramics professors, helping her keep up with her beautiful gardens and stuff. I would go and deadhead and weed and just couldn't put that stuff in garbage bags. I was like, I have to do something with it. So I would haul these garbage bags home. And what I really liked were the lines and the gestures, the branches and the flower heads that created. I felt like I was collaborating with these pieces. Columbine especially had this allure for me. It seemed to have this connection to human gestures and relationships. And that made me think about the relationships between people, and then that led to me thinking about the relationship between people and plants, and then people and the earth, and it kind of evolved into this body of work called salvage. I did have to put this on, press pause on it, put it on the back burner for a couple of years while I went out to Iowa. Then when I came to OSU for my fellowship, I came back to it. I just kept thinking about it and kept wanting to make more. So I began collecting more plant material there. I did bring some from Edinburgh. I had carried that with me out to Iowa and then back again. And I had, for some reason, started saving coconut milk cans because I had smooth walls, and I thought those would be good source material for making tintypes or ferrotypes with. And I hadn't yet thought of using the can lids until I started working on this body of work at OSU. And I was like, wait, why am I not using the can lids too? Like, that's pretty great, these circles. So I started shaping them and cleaning them and japanning them and making these little prototypes. This was the range of size was not very dramatic initially. They're basic kind of can sizes, like Campbell soup or tomato cans. It didn't have a large range of stuff that you would buy at the grocery store, basically. And one of the nice things was people in school found out I was doing this, and they would start depositing bags of can lids at my studio door. I came home one day and there was a big bag of can lids on my front door. It was pretty great. Then I began to start to source larger can lids, and I started using bottle caps too, so I could have a more dynamic range of sizes. The large ones came from the Pines Kitchen at Penland. I was teaching a copper plate photogravure class there one summer, and I don't even remember how the conversation came up, but they started saving the big can lids for me, and I ended up going home with about 3 of those industrial-sized kitchen cans full of lids. So I still have plenty at home to work with. So the range of size of these now goes from 1 inch to about 5.5 inches. And pretty much everything in between. Again, I like to think of this as a collaboration between myself and the materials. I pay a lot of attention to the arrangement of the material. I pay a lot of attention to the exposure, but also the chemicals, the latitude that I have with that, and how I can manipulate that. So sometimes I'll intentionally overexpose and overdevelop so that I can let that plate stay in the cyanide fix longer than normal, because one of the beautiful things about cyanide, as long as you're not drinking it, is that it eats away the silver, so you can create these really beautiful atmospheres by letting it eat away in more areas. And so there's this conversation going on between me and the chemicals too. I watch very carefully and closely what's happening there. I can use an eyedropper to do it in selected areas as well. So it's not just, putting this in the fix and letting it stay for a certain amount of time. There's a lot of decision making and manipulation happening as well. So salvage is constantly growing, and I like that kind of analogy because it's about plants, and plants grow, and this body of work grows. And my knowledge and information, my understanding continues to grow too as I explore more about biodiversity, genetically modified crops, the science and controversy surrounding those topics, as well as how monocrop farming and big agriculture is kind of affecting our flora and fauna. So this next incarnation of salvage includes a field of 3-inch square plates. And those are made on litho plates. And this is the first installation of it. There's a total of 303 photolitho plates here and over 300 unique ferrotypes. And just a side note, because this is also kind of funny, in preparation for this exhibition, I had gone to Review Santa Fe, which is the only juried photo review curator kind of portfolio review. And it's the only, there's lots of them, but this is the only one that's juried. And I talked to everybody that I had a review with. I asked them, how would you install these plates? Because I hadn't yet figured that out. The ferrotypes, I've got that down. The litho plates, I wasn't quite sure. And everybody said, I mean, it was unanimous. Everybody said, blue dots. And I said, okay, great. So I went home, I ordered some blue dots, I did some tests, I put one up on my wall in my kitchen right above my electric kettle where things would be humid and things would change, and worked fine. It was up there for a couple of months before the exhibition, so I had everything prepared. It was going to be an easy installation. I get there, I start putting the grid up on the wall, they won't stay on the wall for more than 5 minutes. And I'm like, oh, I did all of this preparation, all of this planning, and it's not sticking to the wall. So then came out the, now what do I do? I have hours and hours from home, I have to install this, what do I do? Home Depot, buy a long roll of Velcro, it's the only thing that was around and open, and then you sit there and you cut tiny little squares of Velcro and stick it to the back and staple Velcro to the wall. It's a whole big thing. And here's the kicker. 2 years later, when I'm moving out of my house in Columbus to move to Memphis, that plate that I tested on my kitchen was still on the wall. So I could get it to stay on the wall at home for over 2 years, and then couldn't get it to stay for more than 5 minutes in the gallery. Anyway, back to the piece itself. So we have this orderly grid, and that represents the farming practices. And then we have the unique ferrotypes, which represent that unique and diverse flora of the regular kind of world. Where the photolitho plates flow out of the field and interact with the ferrotype plates, those ferrotype plates I leave in the cyanide longer, so they're starting to disappear. So it talks a little bit about what happens in nature with some of these practices. And that decision to use the photolitho plates was intentional. There's a contrast in the color, there's a contrast in the process. They're much easier and faster to make. It references a couple of things. It references a process that is intended to reproduce multiples. And to make them, I had to use a halftone screen, which also kind of references the dissemination of images in newspapers to reach lots of people. And that's what the big factory farming is all about, to get food to a lot of people. So there's that process kind of connects to the idea. This is the most recent installation. This just came down on the 19th. And this is the one I was talking about, that it arrived the afternoon when I was in the air coming here. So I usually bring some of these plates so you can hold and touch and feel, which is really nice, but not this time. One of the things that I love about this body of work is that, and the reason it's sustained me for 7 years now, is the way that it continually grows and changes. And it changes, not just as a result of the venue where it's at and the space that it gets installed in, but in the case of these litho plates, the colors change over time and their exposure to light. If you remember the first slide of that, they're all pretty uniform in the same kind of blue, and now we see some greens and stuff, and it starts to become a little bit more layered in that color and tone. Another way that salvage is growing is there now is this component that I call constructive landscapes. And these are actually made on those walls of the canlets. I cut them open and flatten them out. I also have framed some of them, so we have this, the shapes, we have the round and the things with the corners that kind of mirror or have a conversation with the installation on the wall. So the lids, or the can walls are cut and flattened. I do everything else the same. I Japan them the same. All the chemicals are the same. But I'm using some of my handmade paper to help create some of that landscape that you see in these. And I'm still manipulating the chemistry. Some of the lines that you see there that look like telephone lines, that's actually what happens if you hesitate when you're putting this the plate into the silver bath. So you get these lines. So I'm using that manipulation to create part of the imagery as well. This is another little part. I call these my small constructed landscapes. And they're meant to be seen as multiple pieces to create one image. So they're polyptychs. And there's one that stands alone. But here's a couple of the first few that I made. You can again see those lines from putting them in the silver bath. I have made a few changes in the way that I make these now, in the terms of preparations, but the concept is the same. Just as another little side note, the dimensions, somebody asked me once before, like, how'd you come up with the dimensions for these? And I was like, well, I actually originally intended to use the original plates that I had prepared in my granddaddy's Kodak autograph camera. And I wanted to make some images, but I just wasn't sure what that was going to be about yet. And the small ones were cut to fit into my granny's Kodak Pocket Best Hawkeye camera, which is lavender, by the way. It's one of the colored ones. And I just didn't know what the content of that was going to be, and I was like, you know what, I'm going to play with these in this way. I can get more can lids or cans and make more of those later. But that's how those dimensions came about. They were intended for something else, and then they were appropriated into this body of work. And so some of these new constructed landscapes and some of the salvaged can lids are currently in an exhibition over at Anzengberger Gallery in Vienna right now. Another body of work is notions. I better speed this up. When I practice this, it doesn't take this long, I promise. So this is inspired by another historically graphic process. They're American ivory types or 2B types. I won't talk about the details of that, except that what fascinated me is that it's this layered salt print. So we have this really beautiful salt print that is made translucent. There might be tiny details that are painted on the top layer, but then the second layer is underexposed and then kind of garishly printed, as you can see on the far right image. But then when they're put in registration together, you get this beautiful coloring and subtleness that also, if you see these in person, there's a really, it's hard to describe, but there's this subtle depth and dimension to them that you wouldn't get with just a flat print. It just goes a little bit beyond that. So I really liked those a lot. And they stuck in my head, and eventually I came to modify it a little bit. I don't do every step in that process. I didn't see any reason to adhere that print to a piece of glass. So I started this body of work that I've called Notions. Originally it started with just a few quarter plate images. They're made from wet plate, collodion negatives, and then salt prints. And they, I was kind of thinking about that duality of the conventional notions of women's work and domesticity. This is that previous image. This is what it looks like when you kind of separate those two prints and look behind the curtains. But I was thinking about that because a lot of the things I photographed were objects that were either used or made by my granny, and in this kind of traditionally thought of as women's work, kind of quiet work. And so I started really thinking about that, about how my life is different, and the things that I've chosen to do are different than what she was even thought was possible for her to do. And then in a broader context, expectations for what women's work in general is and how it's evolved over the years and where we might go from there or from here. which is also kind of a poignant thing to be thinking about with today's current political climate. But to kind of compare and contrast, I also photographed some things that were my granddaddy's, tools that I use, materials that I use in my own work that belong to him. Not necessarily these nails, but these nails do, I use them a lot. But some of these hammers were my granddaddy's, and those were also, one of those was also my grandfather's. And I do mix all of my own chemicals. I don't do any kit stuff, so again, the process from start to finish is really important. And the selection of these are currently on display at the Cutler Train Gallery in Memphis right now too. Impractical Library is another body of work, and this is also a sustained one. Notions feels kind of finished. Salvage is ongoing, and Impractical Library is ongoing. I have two bodies, or two sections to that, just like a library has a reference section and a leisure section, so does my library. But this is the body of work that's it's looking at the book as object and how we as a society approach our information and leisure in the 21st century. This kind of came from these pieces. They were part of my MFA thesis, these sculptural books. And I got tired of moving them around. They were heavy and a little bit dangerous, definitely awkward. So I decided to take them apart and do something different with them. And they're already sort of impractical because I had already waxed them. They're reference books. And those are often seen as this kind of archaic. We don't use them so much. When we want to know the definition of a word, we don't necessarily walk over to the shelf and pull the dictionary off the shelf. We pull out our phone and type it in. So these are not books. I'm not destroying any good books. I went to, this was back when there were still a lot of used book stores around. These were the ones they were going to toss anyway. So just to allay any fears, I'm not doing anything to something that wasn't already going to happen. I took that and made it into something new. But that information, or those skills, that knowledge, those technical skills I have from the Center for the Book and from VSW with books, it gives me, I understand the structure and how I can deconstruct it, but then also reconstruct it. And I do so in a way that makes them even more impractical. So this one is not finished yet, because you'll see in a moment. The idea here is that each page has been, I have them kind of separated into folios or sections of 4 pages that are then folded in half. So then when the book is rebound, we're looking at it from a different way. All the pages are out of order, it's not going to read the same way. And then I'm printing them, and I'm taking those 4 pages that reference that folio in the history of the book, and I'm using them as wax paper negatives, which reference the history of a section of history of photographic processes, and I'm creating these prints that create its own new kind of language, and they're really kind of, the text in them is really, I find it to be really beautiful and subtle, but not legible. And the little areas, like the little corner that's turned in, that translucency that happens there. Yeah, anyway, there are a lot of these that have to, I thought I had the number in my notes here about how many prints I would have to make to finish this before I could rebind the book, but I'm not close to being done with that one. It's got some ways to go. But this is the first iteration of that extra large dictionary, and this was the first complete finished piece in that Impractical Library series, if you want to call it finished. Here's a detail of that rebound book side, and I purposely placed those little pamphlets. Each one of those little books is 1 page of that giant dictionary, which has been torn down into its own tiny little pamphlet. So again, it's not really, like you could pick out certain information in certain pages, but you can't, it's not usable in the way that it was before, and it's certainly not organized by the time it goes up on my shelves. So there's no way to, like, if you're trying to look up the word collodion, like, there's no way to find it easily on those shelves. And I used, well, I'll just stay for a moment, back up for a second. I didn't really like the way that those images were installed in the first time around, so I made shelves for them too, so it mimics the kind of book spread that you would look at, so it becomes a giant book on the wall. I'm still not completely sold on it, but we're letting it sit here for a little bit. And I used furniture-grade plywood, as you can see, because I liked the thin laminate layers of that, which to me also looked like the foredge of a book. So that plywood fit conceptually with what I was talking about there. The images that accompany the book structure, or the rebound book, are images directly from the book, and I'm using, again, the page as the negative, and I'm putting that in the enlarger, and then enlarging that onto these aluminum plates. So I call them alumitypes. And so they're exposed. And so there are a lot of the little diagrams, so you get to see both sides of the page at the same time with those. This is the most recent piece in my Impractical library, and it belongs in the reference section. And this is a history and guidebook for music. So I did take apart a book that had already been donated to the Cultural Arts Center and Folk Arts classes that was already missing its cover in a couple of pages and parts of pages, so again, I'm not destroying anything valuable. So I took them and I folded them in half with the grain, those of you that were in the demo earlier. And then I cut them in varying heights to kind of create this undulating rhythm across the head of the book that in my mind referenced the melody of music. And then sewed it onto 5 chords that also represent those 5 lines in the musical staff. I left them long instead of trimming them so that they also became a metaphor for the way music kind of flows and spills and kind of falls into different parts of our lives at different times. And then this book was used to create images from it as well. These are made on large sheets of my handmade paper that were cut into strips. And again, 5 strips to create 5 lines of the staff and the spacing in between. So, let's see, there's a detail of that. Also, I can't help but to share, they were toned using tea that was steeped to the intensity of butter oil. But I'm not gonna lie, I really delight in that pun that I toned prints about a book about music where there's tone involved. Yeah, I like the puns. Okay, I'm just going to show you the other part of Impractical Library, the leisure section, because there's just one part of it, 2 different installations of it. And so this is called Blankscape, and I think of it as landscape or escape, like you escape in a leisure book, or you escape in your garden to do landscaping. And the form that these structural books, or these sculptural books have, kind of make me think of plant material, and the way that they can be installed in the wall makes them feel like a very organic kind of thing that might be growing in a garden. These were also repurposed from my MFA thesis installation. And originally I put them on individual books, became individual little prints. But I decided that I wanted to see that installation looks very different this time around. I wanted to play around with them in larger compositions. So on bigger pieces of handmade paper, I created multi-layered cyanotypes. So they were exposed multiple times, and they would go in with some watercolor and also some, I say bleach, but it's not actually bleach, it's actually very alkaline water, so a bunch of baking soda in water, which will bleach back cyanotype to play around with some of the effects that happen with this sensitizing solution. And so that became the series of images that accompanied the installation structure. So now there's 2 different ways it could go depending on the space. And here's an installation shot or detail of those books on the wall. And those nails from Notion in the bowl, that's what I use the nails for, is this particular installation. I do see that we have about 10 minutes left, so I'll stop here. I do have some other stuff I could share, but I'll stop here in case you have any questions. Yes?
A couple times you referenced this, but could you talk about how failure may like be present in your process or research your final objects. It's like you talk about your blue dots and that
Yes.
failure.
Yes.
How is failure present in your practice?
Oh, all of the things go wrong all the time. The most important thing I think about that is that it offers an opportunity to, number one, you learn more from it, but also that gets you to be thinking about other ways to approach the problem and to figure it out that you might not have thought of. That particular instance, I now have little Velcro dots that are permanently affixed and then they get stapled to the wall, and I have this great template for that so that it's really quick and easy to install. And that's not necessarily, that's more of a practical application. But when that kind of thing happens, the first plate you leave in a cyanide bath, or you don't rinse well and you put in a tray of water and come back to it later and the image is all gone, and you're heartbroken for a moment because you loved that image, but then you kind of file that away, and then that later becomes those plates that are interacting with the litho plates where it's starting to disappear. So you're using that intentionally. So sometimes those mistakes lead you to a more creative application with them later that has a very powerful or impactful I wanted to say a powerful impact, a powerful impact on the work that you're doing later down the road. So I think that failure leads us to new creative approaches and new solutions, and also just broadens our understanding and depth of knowledge with our materials and processes. Yes?
Which do you have photography or photographic artists who are your touchstones that you are constantly mesmerized or inspired by their work?
Oh, that has evolved and changed over the years depending on what I was, interested in. When I was in grad school, I was enamored with Anne Hamilton, one of the reasons I like her so much is that she works in a multitude of processes and ways of thinking, like book arts and photography and installation. She does a lot of performance, which I don't do, but that was one of the artists. So it was a real treat to actually meet her and be able to work with her at the Ohio State University too, and talk with her. But Christian Boltanski, a lot of his work was very impactful to me when I was in grad school. Sally Mann, and not so much the work that most people think of, like her Family of Man project, but later when she actually learned wet plate from the same people that I worked with too. So devious me planned my MFA opening so that she would be there. Because she came to do a talk at the Eastman House, and I knew that was coming because I worked there, and also I knew Mark in France, and I knew that she was going to be there, and I'm like, let me schedule my MFA opening for the night after the talk at the Eastman Museum. So, I orchestrated that. But her larger landscapes, the Deep South work, I really liked. When you see those large and in person, the depth and the tactility to them is really, really amazing. And Robert Park Harrison and Sean Park Harrison for the same reason, not the content necessarily, but the process. I mean, not that I love their content, but I don't work that way, but I still find that really beautiful. A lot of, even early Laszlo Moholy-Nagy and Man Ray and their camera-less images. And then there are a bunch of people that were working in the contemporary today, working camera-lessly, that like Megan Rippenhoff and her amazing cyanotypes that she uses the ocean to create. Those are just pretty astounding to me, conceptually and visually. I won't keep going on. It also kind of depends what my mood is for the day. Who my favorite is or who I'm finding really interesting too, because that can kind of fluctuate. Yes?
Do you find in your projects, do you find that the concept comes and then you try to solve that problem with materials, or does the material come first and the concept emerges? What's that process like?
Both. It really kind of depends. Sometimes it grows out of something that I've tried. Sometimes it's because I want to learn a new process. In fact, one of my two things that I'm starting to work on now that I've been building the foundation for have come from me. There's the process I want to learn that I've been enamored with, and I'm fascinated by it, and I want to try it. And so in that learning how to do it, an idea will come to me. Sometimes, to be honest, sometimes it's because there's a tool that I want, and I'm like, what can I do that would necessitate me getting that tool or making that tool to justify doing it. So there are a lot of different motivating factors. But a couple of things I did bring up here. I really wanted to, I do a lot of paper stuff too, and I'm really fascinated with textiles, and in paper there's kamihito, which is paper thread, and you can make shifu with it, which is woven paper, and that is either the weft is paper or the weft and the warp is paper. And I had seen some of that and felt it and touched it, and been wanting to learn it for years. And this past May, I was able to do that at the Paper Book Intensive up in Oxbow, and learn how to make this kamihito, and I have some up here so you can come touch it and feel it if you want. Which also necessitated, of course, I had to make my own drop spindle, so I made a Turkish drop spindle. For any wood nerds out there, this is Osage orange and purple heart. This is the first thing I turned on the lathe, by the way, so that was a nice excuse to finally get to do that, something I've also wanted to learn for a long time. And so these pieces are weaving these pieces where and this came from a mistake too, not being really good at this weaving on a stump loom first, which is a pin loom. It's just little brads nailed into a piece of wood. And if you're not careful with it, things get kind of distorted. And so I was getting these distortions in the fabric that I was creating. So technically speaking, that's not something that you want, but it got me thinking about the distortion, the warping, the pulling apart, the tension that we're finding in our society today because of the heightened political things that are going on. So that got me thinking about making these, and then I also like to knit, so I was knitting thinking about the fabric of society. So I knit these swatches and scanned them in, and then enlarged the scans and created negatives, and then I printed cyanotypes on them. And then I'm, again, looking into the history of embroidery and my pulled thread embroidery to kind of further manipulate that tension and the pulling apart of communities. And so this is a developing body of work. And those concepts it started with me wanting to learn a process, and in the process of learning through a mistake, this idea kind of was born. So sometimes it's that.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yes?
Whenever you hang your stuff in your galleries and stuff, what do you feel the audience is most tuned into? What draws them in the most? Out of all your artworks that you've created, what do you think they appreciate the most?
Well, I can only speak to what people have said. But with salvage, because that one I have shown the most. That one I am invited to show a lot. People will say, "Hey, we have this opening, this exhibition time slot. Would you? I would love to show salvage." And I'm like, "Okay." So that one, and I spent a lot. I did spend a lot of time when that one was first being developed, sending it out and stuff. That's one downside to working on multiple projects at a time. I mean, promoting work and getting it out there is its own full-time job. So you have to balance that with the making and then, of course, the rest of your life stuff. Teaching, which is also a very important part of my life, and I love doing it. And then just, eating and sleeping and taking dogs out and petting cats and those kinds of things. But what people are most attracted to with salvage is first that kind of impact of the installation. And then when they get up close, they start to notice the subtlety and the differences between each of the individual plates. And none of them I might use the same plant material over. I mean, I do use the same plant material over, but each one is different. Even if I tried to make the same plate, I couldn't do it because you just don't have that. Something is going to pour a little bit differently. The surface of the plate is going to be a little different. But one of the most poignant things that somebody said to me in this last exhibition opening and talk was they noticed the reflection of themselves and the reflection of other people behind them. So they're thinking about what this work is talking about, the environment, and they're seeing themselves reflected in it, and they then start to, make that connection becomes a little more personal. So, they talk a lot about the fact that they find those pieces individually really beautiful and compelling, so that draws them in, but then there's more to understand and to get from it than just it being something pretty to look at. So that's, and then I had people say similar things, similar concepts or similar ideas with Impractical Library. They got them thinking about things in a way that they hadn't before, but they also just enjoyed looking at it, and that's what drew them in first, and that got them thinking. Yes?
What's next for you as an artist? What tool are you planning? What do you want to learn next? And I like that you're always learning. I think that's fantastic.
I will. My not so secret eyes. This project is one, and then my not so secret eyes, which are inspired by these 15th, 16th century secret eye miniature paintings that were secret lovers would exchange them. And they would do it in private. You wouldn't know who that was because it's just their eye. And they would be, sometimes they were really beautiful in these, ornate little settings with gems and precious materials around them. Other times they were in little lockets or cases. And so that was a very private, secret kind of thing. So that was one thing. Then the other side of that is this historic photo process that I don't know of anybody right now working with it, but I've been enamored with it since I first saw it on a tiny piece of jewelry at the Eastman Museum. I'm like, what is this? And I'm like, one day, that's on my list. It's on my list. So it's a photographic process that is then fused through the enameling process. So it's permanent and it's stable. So I plan to create a bunch of eyes that are sourced from the internet. So taking this idea of a secret eye, and then it's my not so secret eye because there is no such thing as privacy anymore. We actually had a little conversation about that at breakfast this morning. And with CCTV, surveillance cameras everywhere, with us just posting our lives out there for everybody to see without even really thinking about it anymore, with the fact that we could be located at any point because all of our devices that we carry with us all the time have these locating devices. There is no such thing as privacy anymore. So my idea is to create a lot of these that can be, I don't have it all worked out yet because this is still in progress, but this is the foundation, the beginning of it. And so, I'm going to create these little, keeping in spirit of the secret eyes, but I want to create a large installation of kind of in the way that salvages lots of small pieces that create a bigger thing. And there are different ways that it can be talked about and looked at and installed. And I have some ideas, but I have to kind of get to the point where things are, to get the process done first. So I've spent the last year that I was in Columbus, I spent taking more enameling, because I hadn't done enameling since undergrad, so I was getting my, and I only did a little bit of it, so I did some more enameling and learned a lot of different processes, different techniques, to see which way I want to go. And I have some ideas for that too, that I have to start doing some tests for. And I have my own kiln now, which was a tool that I wanted to get. I have the enamel, and I finally have a couple of the obscure chemicals that I needed for the photo part, the photo process. So I'm hoping that over winter break, when I've got a little bit more downtime, it's not quite so busy, that I can kind of delve in and focus and really start figuring some of that practical, technical aspect. And then from there, I can move into some of the more conceptual and finishing ideas. And then, of course, I'm working on this too. Which I'm still working on, yeah. Yes?
You mentioned using objects of your family members in some of your photographic work. Has anyone in your family influenced the mediums that you use? Like,
Yes. This project right here, which is mapping the missing memory. There's the title. This is actually, I did this while I was in my fellowship at OSU as well. And these are all images of my sister and I. And at the time, my sister and I used to be really close, and at this particular time, there was a little tension between us. And so this kind of inspired this body of work. I was thinking about all of these memories that I had of her. There's all from slides that my grandparents took of us when we were visiting with them in the summers. And so this breaking of the glass was, in a sense, kind of cathartic, like the tension and the anger that was between us, but also this kind of trying to hold on to these memories. So each of these little fragments is drilled so that I can sew it together again. And in order to put these together, to make the image, I have to create these maps for them, which are bound in the book. And I actually have this piece and the book here if you want to come up and touch and feel and look at it. So visually the book, like each individual map is there, but when you put them together in this book, you get new juxtapositions of these different memories. And there are components that are missing, like the hole where the glass was really shattered and you can't put it back together, so that's missing, but it's been patched with this knitted kind of little swatch of fabric. So that was inspired by, it wasn't an object that was in my family. I mean, it sort of was, my slides from my grandparents. But it was an interaction with my sister, but it kind of speaks to the larger human condition. It's not just about what happened with my sister and I. I've been revisiting this work recently with anonymous images and that idea of this being a memory, this being somebody's memory that's missing. We're missing components of it. We then, as the viewer, which has always been your role even with the work that was about me and my sister, it's still your role as the viewer to kind of piece together that memory and bring your own meaning to it. And the maps are on a different handmade paper now. This is a cotton linen that has my initials watermarked into it. And the knit for the new ones is a little bit bigger. I made my own tiny knitting needles because the first ones I knit using sewing needles, and that's really cumbersome. So I made some knitting. It's a little longer this time. And there's just something really nice about these tiny little knit patches and safety pinning them to their piece of paper that references the piece that they're supposed to go to, because all the shapes are a little bit different. So, yes. Other work has been influenced by that, by family objects or experiences as well. But I try and relate that to the larger human condition or larger issue. A lot of these projects start with me at the seed, like my thoughts or my feelings or my reactions to things, but instead of it being this kind of cathartic or therapeutic kind of thing, I take a look at what's going on and what I'm thinking about and how that connects to the larger world and how I can then frame it and kind of push it so that it's not so me-specific and becomes more about people and how they can interact with it and think about things that I'm thinking about with that too. And so there can be a discussion.
All right, well, thank you so much,
Thank you.
Heather.
Thank you.